Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. There are betrayals that break your heart, and then there are betrayals that shatter your soul, the kind that atomize the very foundation of your reality, leaving you to question every memory, every shared laugh, every single moment of trust you ever offered. Mine was the latter. It wasn't just a simple affair, a sordid cliché played out in 1,000 bad movies. It was a demolition. A controlled, precise, and utterly devastating demolition of my entire world, carried out by the two people I loved and trusted most, my wife, Laura, and my best friend, Mark. Mark and I weren't just friends, we were an institution. 42 years, from scraped knees on the elementary school playground to standing next to each other as best men at our weddings. We were brothers in every way that mattered. We built our first treehouse together with stolen nails and mismatched lumber. We navigated the treacherous waters of adolescence, dissecting every awkward conversation with a girl, every failed attempt at coolness. We were co-pilots through college, propping each other up through all-night study sessions fueled by cheap pizza and even cheaper beer. When my father died, it was Mark's shoulder I cried on. When his business almost went under, it was my life savings I offered without a second thought. Our friendship was a constant, an unshakable pillar in the architecture of my life. He knew me better than I knew myself sometimes. He could finish my sentences, anticipate my moods, and read the silence between my words. He was the keeper of my history, the witness to my life's journey. And then there was Laura. I met her in my late 20s, a whirlwind of bright laughter and intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. Mark was the one who introduced us, ironically enough. He'd known her from a work project and insisted we'd be perfect for each other. He was right. Falling in love with Laura was like coming home. It was easy, comfortable, a perfect fit. We married 2 years later, with Mark standing beside me, a proud grin on his face. Our life together was good, not a Hollywood romance, but something real and enduring. We built a home, raised a wonderful daughter, Sarah, who was now in her second year of college, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long-term marriage. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our shared history. I loved her. I loved the life we had built. I thought she loved it too. I thought we were solid. I thought Mark was solid. The triangle of our relationship, me, Laura, and Mark, was the bedrock of my world. Mark was a constant presence in our lives. He and his wife, Jennifer, were our go-to couple for dinners, for vacations, for everything. When they divorced a few years ago, Laura and I became his primary support system. He was at our house for dinner 3, sometimes 4 times a week. We watched football together in my garage, tinkered with my old Mustang, and drank beer while complaining about getting older. Laura would often join us, teasing us for being a pair of old grumps. She and Mark had their own easy rapport, an extension of our collective friendship. I never saw it as anything more. Why would I? He was Mark. She was Laura. The idea of them together was not just improbable, it was inconceivable. It would be like the sun and the moon deciding to occupy the same space in the sky. It was a violation of the natural order of my universe. The first signs were so subtle, so easily dismissed, that I feel like a fool for not seeing them. It was a slow fade, not a sudden break. Laura became more distant, her attention often elsewhere. She was constantly on her phone, smiling at texts she would quickly hide if I walked into the room. She attributed it to a new demanding project at work. I, the trusting husband, believed her. She started having girls' nights out with a frequency that was unusual for her, coming home late, smelling of wine and a perfume I didn't recognize. I chalked it up to her needing to blow off steam. Mark, too, became slightly more elusive. He'd cancel our standing Thursday night beer and Mustang session, claiming he was swamped with work. He'd seem distracted when we did talk, his answers vague, his eyes not quite meeting mine. I thought he was still struggling with the aftermath of his divorce, that he was depressed. I tried to reach out, to offer support, but he would just brush it off, saying he was fine. I was so wrapped up in my concern for them as individuals, so blinded by my unwavering trust, that I never once thought to connect the two dots. The dots were in different solar systems as far as I was concerned. The discovery, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, gut-wrenching accident. I was looking for a misplaced insurance document in Laura's home office. I was rummaging through the desk drawer and my hand brushed against a small leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. I knew I shouldn't have opened it. Every instinct screamed at me to close the drawer and walk away. But a cold, creeping dread had already taken root in my stomach. I opened it. It wasn't a journal. It was a photo album. A small, intimate album filled with pictures of Laura and Mark. Not pictures from our family vacations or neighborhood barbecues. These were different. Pictures of them on a beach I didn't recognize, Laura's head resting on his shoulder. A picture of them clinking wine glasses in a restaurant we had never been to, their eyes locked in a way that had nothing to do with friendship. A picture of them, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, standing in front of a quaint little bed and breakfast. And then the final picture, the one that stopped my heart. It was a selfie, taken in a dimly lit room. They were in bed. Laura was looking at the camera, a secret, sultry smile on her face. Mark was kissing her neck. The world didn't just tilt, it ceased to exist. The air was sucked from my lungs. The floor fell away. I was in a free fall through a black, soundless void. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped the album. The small book landed on the floor with a soft thud, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent house. I sank to my knees, my mind a maelstrom of confusion and white-hot pain. It wasn't just the betrayal of my wife. It was the face in the picture with her. It was Mark, my brother, my friend of 42 years. The man who held my history in his hands had taken a match to it and set it all ablaze. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, staring at the innocent-looking leather album. It was a bomb, and it had just detonated in the center of my life, leveling everything I had ever known, everything I had ever believed in. The two pillars that held up my entire existence had not just crumbled, they had conspired to crush me beneath them. And the most agonizing part, the thought that looped endlessly in my shattered mind, was that I hadn't seen it coming. I had been living in the eye of a hurricane, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic winds swirling around me, winds that were about to tear my world to shreds. The house was silent when Laura came home, a heavy, suffocating silence that was a stark contrast to the hurricane raging inside my chest. I had picked up the photo album from the floor and placed it in the center of the coffee table, a silent, damning indictment. I was sitting on the couch, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white, my body a coiled spring of rage and grief. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have the words. All I had was a gaping, bleeding wound where my heart used to be. She walked in, humming a cheerful tune, her arms full of groceries. She was the picture of domestic normalcy, a picture that was now a grotesque, twisted caricature. She saw my face, and her smile faltered. Then her eyes fell on the album on the table. The color drained from her face. The grocery bag slipped from her grasp, oranges and onions rolling across the hardwood floor like scattered, forgotten memories. We stared at each other across the room, the distance between us suddenly an unbridgeable chasm. The silence stretched for an eternity. In her eyes, I saw not remorse, not shame, but a flicker of defiance, a hardening of her features that I had never seen before. She had been caught, and she was already preparing for a fight, not an apology. "What is that?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper, the pretense of innocence so thin it was transparent. "You know what it is," I said, my own voice a low, gravelly sound I didn't recognize. "It's your new life, the one you've been building behind my back, with my best friend." The words "best friend" came out like shards of glass, tearing at my throat.
Saying them out loud, connecting them to her betrayal, made it real in a way that the pictures alone had not. She didn't deny it. There was no point. The evidence was lying there between us, irrefutable. Instead, she did something I never would have expected. She got angry. "You went through my things?" she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You invaded my privacy?" The audacity of it was breathtaking. She had systematically dismantled our marriage, our family, and my most sacred friendship, and she was accusing me of a breach of privacy? It was then that I knew the woman I had married was gone, replaced by this cold, defiant stranger. The dam of my own anger broke. The grief and the shock were momentarily washed away by a tidal wave of pure, undiluted rage. We fought. It wasn't a discussion, it was an evisceration. Words were our weapons, and we wielded them with the intent to inflict maximum damage. Years of unspoken resentments, of minor grievances, of quiet dissatisfactions were dragged out into the open, magnified and distorted by the lens of her ultimate betrayal. She told me I was boring, that I was predictable, that I had stopped seeing her as a woman years ago. She said our marriage had been a comfortable cage and that Mark had set her free. Mark. He saw her. He listened to her. He made her feel alive. Every word was another turn of the knife. I threw back at her the years of my devotion, the life I had provided, the unwavering trust I had placed in her. I called her a liar, a cheat, a monster who had destroyed our family for a cheap thrill.
We were no longer husband and wife. We were two mortally wounded animals, lashing out in a desperate, futile attempt to make the other feel even a fraction of our own pain. The argument ended when I couldn't speak anymore, my throat raw, my body trembling with exhaustion. She looked at me, her eyes cold and hard, and said the words that would become the anthem of my solitary nights. "I'm in love with him," she said, "and I'm leaving you." There was no pleading, no begging, no negotiation. It was a statement of fact, a final, brutal severing of the ties that had bound us for nearly 2 decades. She went upstairs and started packing a bag. I stayed on the couch, a hollowed-out shell of a man, listening to the sounds of her departure. The opening and closing of drawers, the rustle of clothes, the final, decisive click of the suitcase latch. She came downstairs, her face a mask of resolute indifference. She didn't look at me. She just walked to the door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence of our broken home. As she opened the door to leave, I asked the one question that still clawed at my insides. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "does he know that I know?" She paused, her back still to me. "He's waiting for me," she said. And then she was gone. The door closed, and I was alone. Utterly, completely alone in a way I had never been before. The silence she left behind was a physical presence, a heavy, crushing weight. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a tomb, filled with the ghosts of a life that was a lie. The next few hours, or maybe days, I don't know, are a blur. I remember wandering from room to room, touching objects, a photograph, a coffee mug, a book she had been reading, as if they were artifacts from another lifetime. I remember finding a bottle of whiskey in the back of the liquor cabinet and drinking until the world dissolved into a merciful, numbing haze. And I remember the phone call. It was from Mark. His name flashed on my screen, and for a split second, a part of me, a stupid, naive part of me, thought he was calling to explain, to apologize, to tell me it was all a horrible mistake. I answered, my heart pounding a frantic, hopeful rhythm against my ribs. "Don't call me," he said, his voice cold and unfamiliar. "Don't call Laura. Don't try to contact us. We need space." There was no apology, no explanation, no remorse, just a command, a demand from the man who had been my brother, the man who had just stolen my wife, that I leave them alone to enjoy the spoils of their treachery. That was the moment the grief turned to ice. That was the moment I understood the true depth of the betrayal. It wasn't a moment of weakness, a regrettable mistake. It was a calculated, deliberate act of destruction. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, they had chosen to erase me. I hung up the phone. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over me. I was a man who had lost everything. My wife, my best friend, my past, my future. I was standing in the smoking rubble of my life with nothing left to lose. The pain was so immense, so all-consuming, that it had gone beyond tears. It was a cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach, a permanent ache that I knew would be my constant companion for a long, long time. The process of dismantling our life was a slow, agonizing torture. Lawyers were called, papers were filed. We had to divide our assets, our possessions, our entire shared history. Every conversation was a stilted, painful exercise in civility, mediated by legal professionals who charged by the hour to witness the dismemberment of our family. The hardest part was telling our daughter, Sarah. She came home from college for a weekend, and we sat her down in the living room, in the same room where the bomb had gone off, and we told her. Laura did most of the talking, her words carefully chosen, sanitized for our daughter's consumption. She spoke of growing apart, of irreconcilable differences. She never once mentioned Mark. But Sarah was not a child. She was a smart, perceptive young woman, and she knew that there was more to the story. She looked at me, her eyes searching for the truth, and in my own shattered gaze, she found it. The look of dawning horror and betrayal on her face was a mirror of my own. I had not only lost my wife and my best friend, I had also lost the happy, intact family that I had worked so hard to build for my daughter. The betrayal was not just mine. It was a legacy of pain that I had now passed on to her. The weeks that followed were a descent into a special kind of hell, a hell of loneliness and memory, a hell where every corner of my home, every street in my town, was a trigger for a fresh wave of pain. I was a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life that was no longer my own. The process of dismantling our life was a slow, agonizing torture. Lawyers were called, papers were filed. We had to divide our assets, our possessions, our entire shared history. Every conversation was a stilted, painful exercise in civility, mediated by legal professionals who charged by the hour to witness the dismemberment of our family. The hardest part was telling our daughter, Sarah. She came home from college for a weekend, and we set her down in the living room, in the same room where the bomb had gone off, and we told her. Laura did most of the talking, her words carefully chosen, sanitized for our daughter's consumption. She spoke of growing apart, of irreconcilable differences. She never once mentioned Mark. But Sarah was not a child. She was a smart, perceptive young woman, and she knew that there was more to the story. She looked at me, her eyes searching for the truth, and in my own shattered gaze, she found it. The look of dawning horror and betrayal on her face was a mirror of my own. I had not only lost my wife and my best friend, I had also lost the happy, intact family that I had worked so hard to build for my daughter. The betrayal was not just mine, it was a legacy of pain that I had now passed on to her. The weeks that followed were a descent into a special kind of hell, a hell of loneliness and memory, a hell where every corner of my home, every street in my town was a trigger for a fresh wave of pain. I was a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life that was no longer my own. The weeks that followed were a descent into a special kind of hell, a hell of loneliness and memory, a hell where every corner of my home, every street in my town was a trigger for a fresh wave of pain. I was a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life that was no longer my own.
The aftermath of a double betrayal is not a clean wound. It's a shrapnel blast. The initial explosion is devastating, but the real, enduring damage comes from the countless jagged pieces of metal that embed themselves in every part of your being. For months, my life was a slow, painful process of discovering just how deeply those pieces had penetrated. The loneliness was the most immediate and suffocating. The house, once a bustling hub of family life, became a mausoleum. The silence was a constant roar in my ears. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for Laura in the empty space beside me, the phantom limb of our marriage still aching with a pain that was all too real. I'd walk into the garage and see the empty chair where Mark used to sit, the air still thick with the ghosts of our shared laughter and easy camaraderie. I had lost my wife and my best friend in one fell swoop, which meant I had lost my two primary confidants. Who do you call to complain about your wife leaving you when she's left you for your best friend? Who do you call to vent about your best friend's betrayal when he's the one who betrayed you? I was an island, completely isolated in my grief. The social fallout was just as brutal. Our friends, who had been our friends, were now forced to choose sides. Some tried to remain neutral, their pity and discomfort a palpable thing in every stilted conversation. Others, inevitably, sided with Laura and Mark. I would hear whispers of how happy they were soulmates who had finally found each other. Every whispered rumor was another grain of salt rubbed into my open wound. I had to watch as the life that was once mine was reassembled with me edited out. They were a couple now, attending the same parties we used to attend, eating at the same restaurants, their new life a grotesque parody of my old one. I saw them once, in the early days. I was at the grocery store, and I turned a corner and there they were, standing in the dairy aisle, looking at yogurt. They were holding hands. They looked so normal, so domestic, so happy. The sight of them together, performing the mundane rituals of a life they had stolen from me, was like a physical blow. I ducked into another aisle, my heart hammering against my ribs, and fled the store, leaving my half-full cart behind. My world had become a minefield of memories. Every song on the radio, every movie we had watched together, every place we had ever been was tainted. My past had been weaponized against me. I couldn't even find solace in my own memories because he was in all of them, the silent, treacherous partner in my life story. I tried to erase him. I went through the house and took down every photograph that had him in it. Our wedding photos where he stood beside me grinning. Family vacation pictures where he was an honorary uncle to my daughter. Photos of us as teenagers, awkward and full of dreams. By the time I was done, there were gaping holes on the walls and in the photo albums, a visual representation of the hole he had left in my life. But I couldn't erase him from my mind. 42 years of friendship is not a file you can simply delete. It's a part of your operating system. My daughter, Sarah, was my only lifeline. She was furious with her mother and with Mark, and her righteous anger was a strange and unexpected comfort. She refused to see them, a decision that caused a deep rift between her and Laura, another piece of collateral damage from their affair. Sarah would call me every day, her voice a small beacon of light in my suffocating darkness. But I was careful not to lean on her too heavily. She was just a kid, with her own life to live, her own heart to protect. It wasn't her job to fix her broken father. I was unraveling. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I drank too much. My work, which had always been a source of pride and stability, began to suffer. I would stare at my computer screen for hours, unable to focus, the numbers and words blurring into an indecipherable mess. I was a man adrift, with no anchor and no shore in sight.
The lowest point came about 6 months after Laura left. It was a Tuesday night. I was sitting alone in the dark, a bottle of whiskey my only companion, flipping through one of the photo albums I had purged of Mark's presence. But even in the photos of just me and Laura, he was there, in the shadows, in the ghost of a memory. And I just broke. A sound came out of me that I had never heard before, a raw, primal howl of pain and rage and despair. It was the sound of a man who had reached the absolute bottom. I sat on the floor and wept, not just for the loss of my wife and my friend, but for the loss of the man I used to be, the naive, trusting fool who believed in things like loyalty and forever. In the midst of that breakdown, a single clear thought cut through the fog of my despair. I could not go on like this. I could either let this destroy me completely, let them win by turning me into a bitter, broken man, or I could fight. I could choose to survive. The next day I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a therapist. The second was to a real estate agent. I knew I couldn't heal in that house. It was a museum of pain, a constant, suffocating reminder of everything I had lost. I needed to escape. I needed a new beginning, a place with no memories, a blank canvas on which to paint a new life. Selling the house was a painful, cathartic process. Packing up 20 years of a shared life was like performing an autopsy on my own marriage. Every object held a story, a memory that now felt like a lie. But with every box I packed, I felt a little lighter. I was not just packing up my possessions, I was packing up my past. I found a small apartment in a different part of town, a place that had no connection to my old life. It was small, it was sterile, it was anonymous, and it was perfect. The day I moved out of my old house, I took one last walk through the empty rooms. The echoes of laughter and life were gone, replaced by an airy silence. I didn't feel sad. I felt a sense of release. I was closing a door, a heavy iron door on the most painful chapter of my life. My new life was quiet and solitary. I started to focus on the small things. I learned to cook for one. I bought new furniture, pieces that were chosen by me and only me. I started going to the gym, channeling my anger and grief into physical exertion. I started reading again, getting lost in the stories of others as a way to escape my own. My therapy sessions were my anchor. My therapist, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Evans, gave me a safe space to unload the poison that had been festering inside me. She helped me understand that my grief was not just for the loss of the relationships, but for the loss of my own identity. I had been a husband and a best friend for so long that I didn't know who I was without those titles. The process of rediscovering myself was a slow and faltering one. There were good days and bad days. Days when I felt a flicker of hope, a sense of possibility, and days when the loneliness was a physical ache, a crushing weight that made it hard to get out of bed. But for the first time since the demolition of my world, I was building something new. It wasn't the life I had planned, not the life I had wanted, but it was my life. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.
The path to rebuilding a life from rubble is not a glamorous one. There's no montage with upbeat music. It's a slow, gritty, day-by-day process of laying one brick at a time, often with hands that are still shaking. My new apartment was my construction site. For the first year, it was less a home and more a bunker, a safe house where I could retreat from a world that felt hostile and alien. But slowly, I started to bring it to life. I painted the walls a color Laura would have hated. I bought a ridiculously comfortable couch that was perfect for napping, not for entertaining. I built bookshelves and filled them with books I had always meant to read. I was creating a space that was unequivocally mine, a declaration of independence from my past. The therapy with Dr. Evans was the architectural blueprint for this new construction. She helped me see that my identity had been so intertwined with Laura and Mark that I had lost my own center of gravity. My weekends had been their weekends. My hobbies had been their hobbies. We were a unit, and when that unit imploded, I was left as a fragment. So I started to search for my own center of gravity. I revisited old passions I had let slide over the years. I picked up my guitar again, the calluses on my fingertips a welcome, tangible sign of my reconnection with a part of myself I had forgotten. I started hiking, finding a strange solace in the quiet, indifferent majesty of nature. On a mountain trail, surrounded by ancient trees, my own problems felt appropriately small. The most difficult brick to lay was trust. The betrayal had rewired my brain. I became suspicious, cynical.
I saw potential treachery everywhere. When a colleague was overly friendly, I questioned their motives. When a neighbor offered to help with a heavy box, my first thought was, what did they want? Relearning how to trust both others and my own judgment was the hardest part of the rebuild. I made a conscious effort to reconnect with the friends who had stuck by me, the ones who hadn't been caught in the blast zone of my divorce. It was awkward at first. I had been a ghost for so long that I had to relearn the language of friendship. But they were patient. They let me talk about it when I needed to, and they let me be silent when I didn't.
They didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. They just showed up. They dragged me out to a baseball game. They brought over pizza and beer. They reminded me that not all relationships are built on a foundation of lies. About 2 years after the split, I received an email from Jennifer, Mark's ex-wife. I hadn't spoken to her since everything happened. She had heard about what happened and wanted to offer her sympathies. We met for coffee. It was a strange, surreal experience. We were two people who had been betrayed by the same two people. We compared notes, not with malice or glee, but with a kind of weary resignation. She told me she had seen the signs of Mark's narcissism and Laura's discontent for years, but like me, she had never put the two together. Talking to her gave me a new perspective. It helped me see that I wasn't just a victim of a random act of passion. I was a victim of two deeply flawed individuals who had prioritized their own selfish desires above everything and everyone else. It didn't lessen the pain, but it made it less personal. It wasn't just about my failures as a husband. It was about their failures as human beings. I started to feel less like a fool and more like a survivor. The thought of dating was terrifying. The idea of making myself vulnerable to another person seemed like an act of insanity. But Dr. Evans gently pushed me. She said I didn't have to get married. I just had to have a conversation. I downloaded a dating app, my thumb hovering over the Create Profile button for a full 10 minutes before I finally committed. My first few dates were disasters. I was rusty, awkward, and probably radiated an aura of damaged goods. But I kept at it, not because I was desperate to find someone, but because it was an exercise in reclaiming my life. It was proof that I was not going to let my past dictate my future. And then I met Claire. She was a librarian with a quick wit and a kind smile. Our first date was just coffee, and we talked for 3 hours. I told her, in a heavily abridged version, that I was divorced. I didn't go into the sordid details. I wasn't ready for that. But she didn't press. She had her own story of heartbreak, her own scars. We were two people who understood that life doesn't always go according to plan. Our relationship grew slowly, cautiously. It was nothing like my relationship with Laura. It wasn't a whirlwind of certainty and shared futures. It was a gentle unfolding, a process of learning to trust again, one day at a time. Claire knew that I had walls up, and she didn't try to tear them down. She just waited patiently for me to open the door myself. The final ghost was laid to rest on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I was at a hardware store, and I heard a familiar voice. It was Mark. He was with Laura. They were arguing about paint swatches, their voices sharp and irritated. They looked miserable. The passionate, soulmate glow I had seen in the grocery store years ago was gone, replaced by the dull, weary friction of a relationship that had been built on a foundation of destruction. He looked older, heavier. She looked tired, her face etched with lines of discontent. He saw me. His face went pale. He started to walk towards me, his mouth opening as if to say something. I just looked at him, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no hatred, no pain. Just a profound, empty indifference. He was a stranger, a ghost from a life that was no longer mine. I turned my back on him and walked away. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his explanation. My healing had nothing to do with him. I had done it myself. I had walked through the fire and rebuilt my life from the ashes, brick by painful brick. As I drove home, to my apartment, to the life that I had built for myself, I thought about the man I had become. The betrayal had shattered me, yes, but in a strange way,
it had also forged me into someone stronger, someone more resilient, someone more self-aware. I had lost everything, but in the process, I had found myself. My life today is not the one I envisioned all those years ago. It's smaller, it's quieter, and it's infinitely more authentic. My happiness is not dependent on anyone else. It's something I have built, something I own. The scars are still there. They always will be. They are a part of my story, a reminder of the cost of trust and the reality of betrayal. But they no longer hurt. They are just a part of the map of a life that was almost destroyed, but wasn't. A life that I survived. If you made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. What's the hardest truth you've ever had to face about someone close to you? Drop your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers for more powerful true stories.